Hello, is this microphone okay at this high and everything? Well, thanks for the invitation to participate here. Also, hello to the people watching at home. This work is a joint work with Nicole, Andrea, and Martina Velez, who couldn't be here. And we set out first some guidelines that were previously discussed by Rama and in different other presentations. What could be considered what we call a development-oriented energy transition strategy. And then we dig into whether the multilateral development banks, particularly two, we looked at two, which are the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, how do they fit? How do they, what grade should they get according to the strategy, both looking at the principles they set forth and at their actual lending practices for energy transition. We focus particularly on energy transition, not looking much beyond, for instance, on climate finance, only that particular item. Well, we heard in this conference, and I wouldn't like to repeat too much, there is an emphasis on private finance for energy transition because of alleged public difficulties for financing investment due to the amounts, concerns with fiscal trajectories. We do emphasize, however, that this focus on private investment actually weakens the potential effect of private investment itself. We all know even the IMF has done some work on the crowding in effects of public infrastructure spending. Beyond also what Mariana Mazzucato and others, and was mentioned also before, called for market creation and shaping as part of a public policy. Mitigation funding and finance focus almost exclusively on decarbonization. That's the sole criteria. This might be particularly damaging for peripheral economies because it omits productive structures. It has no view, does not take into consideration distributed partners. And mostly it precludes different strategies for structural change. Says absolutely nothing about the development of technological capabilities. So we propose, in line with what has been said before, a development-oriented energy transition strategy. At least we propose the initials. They fit quite well. So if somebody wants to adopt them, it's free for use. And we think that even an energy transition climate mitigation strategy can also include other considerations: public policy for housing and transportation, public procurement. In general, the guiding principle is that an energy finance strategy should be aligned and should be part and designed at the same time and interacting with green industrial policy, with development policy itself, not to be isolated as it is, as currently is. We acknowledge, of course, that MDBs cannot make up this financing gap. They could aid, they could provide some aid, they could provide some guide, but they fail short on both accounts, particularly with regards to technological development and structural change. Not only on the common principles for mitigation finance, about which I will talk just in a minute, but also on their actual lending practices. And we have some evidence to show in that regard. The common principles for climate mitigation finance tracking were initially established in 2015. They were recently updated in 2023. They were developed jointly by the Joint Climate Finance Tracking Group of Multilateral Development Banks and representative members of the International Development Finance Club. This whole list of initials include, among these Joint Climate Finance Tracking Group of MDBs include the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, Islamic, the Council of Europe Development Banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, the European Investment Bank, MIGA, which is the guarantee agency branch of the World Bank, and a few more. There are also, just as there are climate mitigation finance tracking, there are also common principles for adaptation finance tracking that were also issued in 2015 and also updated in 2023. For the MDBs, the list of activities is exclusive in a particular sense that only listed activities are considered for climate mitigation finance. For the International Development Finance Club, it's not an exclusive list, it's a guideline. And if you take the painful and boring task of reading through this list and the justification and example I did, the only and exclusive focus of mitigation is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the only one. The update of last year includes new activities, but also excludes activities that, though reducing emissions in the short term, may risk locking in emissive technologies in the long term, according to a methodology developed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. What are these possible excluded technologies? Changes on existing installations which may require enduring fossil fuel use. And the principles include different types of financing, and perhaps there will be somewhat more talk about it later. These include advisory services, equity, grants, bonds, guarantees, refinancing, working capital, lines of credit, etc., etc. This one I already say here. They list 3 types of activities: those that have negative or very low emissions, the transitional activities where there are no alternatives for this, they comply with health standards, they do not hamper the development or deployment of low emission technologies, nor do they lead to the lock-in of high emission intensive assets. And they also include enabling activities which are necessary for mitigation activities and also meet the other 2 criteria. The exclusive and sole focus on emission reductions runs throughout the principles. The word employment does not appear once. The word capabilities appear once. The list applies to the following sectors: energy, mining, manufacturing, agriculture, forest and agriculture, fishing, land use and forest, water supply, waste management, transport. Well, the list is always there. I must acknowledge some caveats. They do take into consideration when assessing certain activity that they use best locally available technologies for projects that aim, for instance, for a lower carbon water supply. The use of economically viability criteria under local conditions for treatment of mixed residual waste, and they do include financing of R&D. What we did was to compile a database of projects from the 2 main banks lending and financing Latin American and Caribbean economies. Our focus, as the title of my presentation says, was put on Latin American and Caribbean lending, and was put by the two main MDBs, which are the World Bank Group and the Inter-American Development Group. We compiled a database of over 2,000 projects through the sovereign window of the World Bank, of which around 15% were for Latin American economies, and almost 3,000 projects through the non-sovereign window of the World Bank. Around also 15, a bit more percent, were for Latin American countries. The Inter-American Development Bank Group finances only Latin American and Caribbean countries. We compiled a database with over, a number, 4,690 projects for sovereign lending, and almost 600 from IDB Invest, which is the non-sovereign window. We adopted a classification. I can, if you want, I can put all the caveats and how do we classify it, but let's move on. This one I mentioned, here. Some preliminary results. One point is the dynamics of the loans. They have been falling. The amounts of approved projects per year, they have a relative, particularly the IFC, that is a non-sovereign window. The IDB in general was somewhat stable lending, and in some cases there were no lending from the IBRD for Latin America for energy transition related projects. In terms of volume, well, again, there has been a mixed performance. The IBRD has lent some volume in 2022, which is the final year of our database, but there were a couple of years in which they didn't lend a single dollar. I can go through a lot of graphs that we have, comparing the amounts lent in the sovereign window and in the non-sovereign window. The volumes, let's say, the volumes lent to energy transition were relatively, they matched the movements of total lending by these banks. There was no particular orientation towards financing energy transition. The same about the approved projects. Again, these very small and very low dashed lines show that what is the proportion, what is the share of total lending that went into energy transition projects, and the share is very, very, very low. Now, what have they been financing? They have been financing somewhat decarbonization projects, renewable energy projects, and mobility projects, most of the time. Somewhat of biogas. These are in terms of volume, of magnitude. The difference between that one and this one is that this covers total, all the credit for energy transition lending from these two banks in the sovereign window, and that covers only Latin America. Again, in Latin America, there was no financing for gas, but it was very significant for all in the whole portfolio of the World Bank projects. But in Latin America, they were focused on decarbonization, renewable energy, bio, and energy efficiency. This is for the non-sovereign. Perfect, I'm quite okay. This is the non-sovereign window. In that, also there are solar, wind, renewable energy comprises mixed when there are projects that include both several types of energy or which do not specify which particular technology they include. There is a bit for energy efficiency and somewhat gas. But all in all, what, this is an important PowerPoint slide. Let me say, all in all, R&D is very, very little. I will show again here. There is no, almost no R&D financing. And again, there is no, I will mention some bit more on the conclusions. Syndicated amounts. Syndicated amounts is a proxy for mobilizing, right, for blended finance or whatever you want to call it. We can only, there is only available amounts that we can identify in the database of the IDB Invest, which is a non-sovereign window of the IDB, of the Inter-American Development Bank. They managed to mobilize one caveat. This does not necessarily mean private. It only means syndicated. The database does not identify either whether these amounts are actual or expected, and from who and who else put the money in. It only says that it also mobilized other funds. That's all it says. For energy transition, there is a relatively better success, but than for total loans, and particularly for gas and grids. But still, as you can see, the levels are well below the initial expectations. In the case of the international of the sovereign window of the IFC, of the International Financial Corporation, there is data not in the projects, but they did publish a report for the fiscal year 2023. And I read for you what they say. For climate finance, which is a larger classification that includes energy transition, they lent $7.6 billion in 2023. They mobilized additional funds for 6.8, which means they didn't even match up 100%. What were the objectives of lending? What type of funding? Well, most of the projects, almost in many cases, 100% of the projects, for instance, dedicated to finance, 100% dedicated to biogas, to critical materials, etc., were for institutional strengthening. There we include technical assistance, technical cooperation, development policy lending. So these are not even fixed capital. They may be important. I'm not one that underestimates the importance of capability development, but they are not iron or windmills, etc. So let me go to some preliminary conclusions, because this is still an ongoing work. We got the database recently. Energy transition follows the dynamics of total credit. There does not seem to be a particular orientation to favor energy transition. There is very little mobilization of private funds. There is not a single project in the entire base that has been classified as nuclear. The IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, explicitly excludes nuclear lending, and I, for one, I do support the development of the nuclear sector. There is very little amount for grids, which is very, very important. I come from Argentina, which is a country of 4,000 kilometers long, and all the sources of solar, wind, and solar energy and wind energy are 2,000 kilometers away from the main consumption center. So we need investment in grids and many other, imagine Brazil, I mean, I don't have to say it. Grids are very, very important. And there is little, if at all, evidence of a strategy for developing local content. There is much more evidence for reinforcing current primarization orientation, such as the funding of gas, critical materials, and one may argue a bit about renewable energy. Almost on time. End of the presentation. No, I did not. There.
Very much, Pablo. Adriana, please.